Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Repair of the Breach. Just wanted to make a quick video on some rabbis on Isaiah chapter 53 about the servant. The one voice is the traditional view that Isaiah 53 speaks of a Messiah, the suffering servant who would die as the ultimate atonement, bearing the sins of Israel and others. Jonathan ben Uziel's Targums on this passage, dating from the 1st century, begins Isaiah 52:13 by immediately identifying the suffering servant as a Messiah, saying, "Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper." The Babylonian Talmud states the Rabbanan say that the Messiah's name is the suffering scholar of Rabbi's house, or the leper scholar, for it is written, "Surely he has borne our grief and carried our sorrows, yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted." Here, the Babylonian Talmud applies Isaiah 53:4 to the Messiah. The Babylonian Talmud also states, "The Messiah, what is his name?" The rabbis say, "The leprous one." Those of the house of Rabbi say, "The sick one," as it is said, "Surely he has borne our sicknesses." Here, the Babylonian Talmud also applies Isaiah 53:4 to the Messiah. In Midrash Sifreh, we find the following. Rabbi Yosef the Galilean said, "Come forth and learn the righteousness of the King Messiah, and the reward of the just from the first man who received but one commandment, a prohibition," talking about Adam, "and transgressed it. Consider how many deaths were inflicted upon himself, upon his own generations, and upon those that followed them, till the end of all generations. Which attribute is greater, the attribute of goodness or the attribute of vengeance?" He answered, "The attribute of goodness is the greater, and the attribute of vengeance is less. How much more then will the King Messiah, who endures affliction and pains for the transgressors, as it is written, he was wounded, etc., justify all generations?" And this is what is meant when it is said, "And the Lord made the iniquity of us all meet upon him." Here, the Midrash Sifreh applies Isaiah 53:5 and Isaiah 53:6 to the Messiah. The argument is, if the transgression of Adam, the first man, who was given one prohibition, resulted in such consequences upon all of his descendants, all generations, and since the attribute of goodness is greater and more powerful than vengeance, how much more will the sufferings of the Messiah justify all generations? This argument is strikingly similar to that made by the Apostle Paul in Romans 5:15-19. In Midrash Tanhuma, we find the following. Rabbi Nachman say, the word man in the passage, "every man ahead of the house of his fathers," refers to the Messiah, the son of David, as it is written, "Behold the man whose name is Zemah, the branch," where Jonathan interprets, "Behold the man Messiah," Zechariah 6:12. And so it is said, "A man of pains and known to sicknesses." Here the Midrash Tanhuma applies Isaiah 53:3 to the Messiah. In Midrash Pshichta, it states, "The Holy One brought forth the soul of the Messiah and said to him, 'Art thou willing to redeem my sons?' He replied, 'I am.' God replied, 'If so, thou must take upon thyself chastisements in order to wipe away their iniquity, as it is written, Surely our sicknesses he has carried.' The Messiah answered, 'I will take them upon me gladly.'" Here, the Midrash Pshichta applies Isaiah 53:4 to the Messiah, and clearly states that the Messiah's sufferings were necessary to wipe away the iniquity of all people. In Midrash Conan, we find the following. "The fifth mansion is paradise. There dwell Messiah, son of David, and Elijah, and Messiah, son of Ephraim. There also is the litter of the wood of Lebanon, and within it Messiah, son of David, who loveth Jerusalem. Elijah taketh him by the head, lays him down in his bosom, holds him, and says, Bear thou sufferings and wounds wherewith the Almighty doth chastise thee for Israel's sin. And so it is written, He was wounded for our transgression, bruised for our iniquities, until the time when the end should come. Here, the Midrash Conan applies Isaiah 53:5 to the Messiah. In this passage, we also see the concept of two Messiahs. This passage clearly distinguishes between the suffering servant, the Messiah, and Israel, stating that the Messiah would suffer for Israel's sin. In referring to this passage, Bamidbar Rabbah states, like Moses, Messiah will be revealed, then hidden, then revealed again. Concerning Isaiah 52:13, Yalkut 2 states, Messiah, he shall be higher than Abraham. The Musa prayer from Yom Kippur was written in the 7th century. Part of the prayer, the Mashor, states, Our righteous anointed is departed from us. Horror has seized us, and we have none to justify us. He has borne the yoke of our iniquities and our transgressions, and was wounded because of our transgressions. He beareth our sins on his shoulder, Isaiah 9:6, that he may find pardon for our iniquities. We shall be healed by his wound. At the time the Eternal will create him, the Messiah, as a new creature. Oh, bring him up from the circle of the earth. Raise him up from Sarah to assemble us the second time by the power of Yinon. To assemble us the second time. But when was the first time? Here, the Musa prayer applies Isaiah 53 to the Messiah and states that he had departed. This presumes that he had previously came and had already suffered on behalf of the Jewish people, bearing their sins on his shoulders. The prayer asks earnestly for Messiah to return a second time. The Zohar, thought to have been written either by Shion ben Yochai in the 2nd century or by a Spanish rabbi in the 13th century, states, There is in the Garden of Eden a place called the Palace of the Sons of Sickness. This palace, the Messiah that enters and summons every sickness, every pain, and every chastisement of Israel. They all come and rest upon him. And were it not that he had thus lightened them off Israel, and taken them upon himself, there had been no man able to bear Israel's chastisements for transgressions of the law. And this is that which is written, Surely our sickness has he carried. Here, the Zohar applies Isaiah 53:4 to the Messiah, and distinguishes Messiah from Israel. Messiah is seen as vicariously bearing Israel's punishment for transgressing the law. Rabbi Moshe had Darshan of Narbonne, a rabbi of the 11th century, in his Bereshit Rabbah, repeatedly applies Isaiah 52:13 through Isaiah 53:12 to the Messiah. This is that which is written, I will lift mine eyes unto the hills, and whence cometh my help. Who art thou, O great mountain? The great mountain means the Messiah. And why does he speak of him thus? Because he is greater than the patriarchs. As it is said, Behold, my servant shall prosper. Isaiah 52:13. I have learned it from the words of Rabbi Moshe Kadarshan, the Redeemer, whom I shall raise up from among you, will have no father. As it is written, Behold, the man whose name is Zemah, the branch, and he shall branch up out of his place, Zechariah 6:12. And so Isaiah says, and he came up like a sucker, etc. Says Rabbi Barakiah, the Holy One said to Israel, the Redeemer, whom I shall raise up out of your midst, will have no father also. As it is said, Behold, the man whose name is the branch, and he shall branch up out of his place. Zechariah 6:12. And similarly by Isaiah, and he came up as a sucker before him. Isaiah 53:2. The Holy One said, O Messiah, my righteousness, said he, the iniquity of those who are hidden beside thee will cause thee to enter into a hard yoke. Thine eyes shall see no light, and thine ears shall hear great reproaches from the nations of the world. Thy nostrils shall smell ill savors, thy mouth taste bitterness, and thy tongue cleave to thy gums. Thy skin shall hang upon thy bones, and thy body grow weak in grief and sighing. Art thou willing to accept this? If so, it shall be well. But if not, behold, I drive them from me forever, said the Messiah. Lord of the world, I accept it joyfully, and I will endure these chastisements, upon the condition that thou givest life again to those who die in my days, and to those who die from that time of the first man until now, and that thou savest in my days not only these, but such as were born out of due time, nor again these only, but those also whom thou thoughtest to create, but who were not created. The Holy One replied, I will do so. And forthwith the Messiah accepted the chastisements of love, as it is written, he was oppressed and he was afflicted. This is the King Messiah, who belonged to the generation of the wicked, but rejected them, and chose the Holy One and his holy name to serve him with all his heart, and applied himself to seek for mercy for Israel, and to fast and humble himself on their behalf. As it is said, he was wounded for our transgressions, etc. And when Israel is sinful, the Messiah seeks for mercy upon them, as it is written, by his stripes we were healed. And he carried the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. In referring to Isaiah 53:7, Rabbi Had Darshan states, then took Messiah lovingly all the sufferings upon himself. In these passages, Rabbi Had Darshan applies Isaiah 52:13, Isaiah 53:1, Isaiah 53:7, Isaiah 53:5, Isaiah 53:12 to the Messiah. It should be noted that branch is a name for the Messiah, who in the second and third passages is also referred to as the Redeemer. In these passages, it clearly states that the Messiah would not have a father. Interestingly, it does not state that the Messiah would not have a mother. The fourth passage applies Psalm 22:14, 15, and 17 to the Messiah, and indicates that the sufferings of the Messiah were absolutely necessary to accomplish salvation for mankind. The fifth passage clearly distinguishes between the Messiah and Israel, using Isaiah 53:5 and Isaiah 53:12 to demonstrate that the Messiah would suffer vicariously for the sins of Israel. In 11th century writing, Mysteries of Rabbi Shion ben Yochai states, Messiah, the son of Ephraim, will die there, and Israel will mourn for him. And afterwards, the Holy One will reveal to them Messiah, the son of David, whom Israel will desire to stone, saying, Thou spakest falsely. Already is the Messiah slain, and there is none other Messiah to stand up after him. And so they will despise him, as it is written, despised and forlorn of men. Wait, Messiah already came and they slain him? So they won't accept the second Messiah? So here we can see the concept of the two Messiahs beginning in the 11th century. Messiah, son of Ephraim, who was a son of Joseph, would suffer and die first. Afterward would come the second Messiah, the son of David. Here, Isaiah 53:1 is applied to Messiah, son of David, whom Israel would not readily accept, but instead desired to kill. Rabbi Tobiah ben Eliezer, a rabbi of the 11th century, in his Legatov, states, and let his kingdom be exalted. In the days of the Messiah, of whom it is said, Behold, my servant shall prosper. He will be high and exalted and lofty exceedingly. Here, Rabbi Ben Eliezer applies Isaiah 52:13 to the Messiah. Rashi, toward the end of the 11th century, was the first to apply Isaiah 53 to Israel. Initially, he applied it to the Messiah. See Sanhedrin 93. Only after the Crusades began did Rashi assert that the suffering servant was Israel. However, Rashi's new view was seen as an aberration from the traditional view that it spoke of the Messiah. Maimonides, perhaps the most famous rabbi of all time, in a letter to Jacob of Hahumi stated, "What is to be the manner of Messiah's advent, and where will be the place of his first appearance?" Wait, first appearance? Will he have a second appearance then? And Isaiah speaks similarly of the time when he will appear. He came up as a sucker before him, and as a root out of dry earth. Isaiah 53:2. In the words of Isaiah, when describing the manner in which the kings will hearken to him, at him the kings will shut their mouth, for that which had not been told them they have not seen, and that which they had not heard have they perceived. In this quote, Maimonides applied Isaiah 52:15 and Isaiah 53:2 to the Messiah. Rabbi Moshe Cohen Ibn Crispin of Córdoba and Toledo, Spain, writing about this passage is approximately 1350, stated, "I am pleased to interpret it in accordance with the teaching of our rabbis of the King Messiah, and will be careful, so far as I am able, to adhere to the literal sense. Thus, possibly, I shall be free from the fancied and far-fetched interpretations of which others have been guilty." He means the Christians, the Nazarenes. Don Yizek Abarbanel, writing in about 1500, made a statement that is particularly significant because his own view was that Isaiah was not speaking of the Messiah. Concerning Isaiah 52:13 through Isaiah 53:12, he stated, "The first question is to ascertain to whom it refers. For the learned among the Nazarenes expounded of the man who was crucified in Jerusalem at the end of the second temple, and who, according to them, was the Son of God, and took flesh in the virgin's womb, as it is stated in their writings. But Jonathan ben Uziel interprets it in the Targum of the future Messiah. But this is also the opinion of our learned men in the majority of their Midrashim." So, in spite of his personal view, Abarbanel was honest enough to admit that the majority of the rabbis of the Midrashim took the passage to speak of the Messiah. He thus agreed that this was a dominant Jewish view of the period of the Targumim and the Midrashim. You hear that, Tovia Singer? In the 16th century, we have the following words of Rabbi Shadaya ibn Danan of Granada concerning the same Isaiah passage. One of these, Rabbi Joseph ben Caspi, was led so far as to say that those who expounded it of the Messiah, who is shortly to be revealed, gave occasion to the heretics to interpret it of Jesus. May God, however, forgive him for not having spoken the truth. Well, that's your opinion. Our rabbis, the doctors of the Talmud, deliver their opinions by the power of prophecy, possessing a tradition concerning the principles of interpretation, alludes covertly to the King Messiah. Thus, Rabbi Ibn Danan asserted that the dominant view of Isaiah 53 of the Talmudic period was that it referred to the sufferings of the Messiah. In addition, Ibn Danan states that one reason Rabbi ben Caspi was against interpreting the passage to speak of the Messiah is because of the passage was being applied to Yeshua. It appears that attempts to interpret this passage as applying to Israel were driven by anti-Yeshua motives, rather than a sound principles of interpretation. Rabbi Moshe El-Sheikh was a disciple of Joseph Caro, author of the Shulchan Aruch, writing in the latter half of the 16th century. Rabbi El-Sheikh stated, our rabbis of blessed memory with one voice accept and affirm the opinion that the prophet is speaking of the King Messiah, and we shall ourselves also adhere to the same view. Again, we see all their interpretation is that Isaiah 53 is applied to King Messiah. Rabbi Elijah de Vidas, writing from the latter half of the 16th century, stated, "And this is that which is written, but he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, the meaning of which is that since the Messiah bears our iniquities, which produced the effect of his being bruised, it follows that whose will not admit that the Messiah thus suffers for our iniquities must endure and suffer for them himself." Here Rabbi de Vidas applies Isaiah 53:5 to the Messiah by stating, since the Messiah bears our iniquities, Rabbi de Vidas appears to assume that this was common knowledge, the dominant view. He goes on to state that anyone who refuses to admit, believe, accept, and possibly confess that the Messiah would bear our iniquities must suffer for his or her own sins. This is exactly similar to what the Apostle Paul said again, "Let your blood be upon your own head." In the 17th century, Rabbi Naphtali ben Asher al-Shusheler stated, "I will now proceed to explain these verses of our own Messiah." Again, we see after the 11th century that the rabbis starting to try to distinguish and interpret it a little different, but it's the same interpretation that the Christians have. I'm surprised that Rashi and Rabbi David Kimchi have not, with the Targums, applied it to the Messiah likewise. Thus, Rabbi Al-Shuler likewise asserted that the dominant Jewish view of the period of the Targumim was that the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 is none other than the Messiah. This 17th century rabbi was surprised that one would take any other view, just as I'm surprised with Rabbi Tovia Singer, who says that it's not about the Messiah. Hels Holmberg in his Quorum, written in 1818, wrote, "The fact is that it refers to the King Messiah, who will come in the latter days when it will be the Lord's good pleasure to redeem Israel from among the different nations of the earth." Before his death on June 12, 1994, Lubavitcher Rabbi Menachem Schneerson was considered by many in his ultra-Orthodox sect to be the Messiah, Mashiach in Hebrew. He was very ill during his last months. His followers placed an advertisement in the Manhattan Jewish Sentinel less than 2 months before his death. The advertisement stated, "How can the Rebbe be Mashiach if he is ill?" Mashiach is described as one who is ill, and he is wounded for our transgressions, Yeshayahu 53. When his time comes, God says, "I shall make him as a new creation." Thus, the verse says, "Today I have given birth to him. His moment of healing has come." Yalkut Shimoni, Tehillim, chapter 2. Yehi Shemelech, Hamelech. The Lubavitcher Rebbe has declared that the time of the redemption has arrived. Yeshayahu is Isaiah in Hebrew. Here, as recently as April 1994, members of the Lubavitcher movement clearly and publicly applied Isaiah 53:5 to the Messiah. So here are a few rabbis mentioning Isaiah 53 and the interpretation, which clearly is about King Messiah. There's no way around that. So, for those who say that it's talking about Israel and that the rabbis always say that it's about Israel, well, sorry, but I don't agree.